Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about North Korea. Tillerson, of course, has people talking about it because of his comments regarding, oh, well, there are no options being left off the table in dealing with the DPRK. China comes out. After decades of shielding them and being sort of friendly to the DPRK, they've become ambivalent, and now they actually join in the international chorus of condemning them for certain actions from time to time. It's actually a seismic shift within Chinese policy as they look to we want to develop things in Africa and partner with Pakistan and Thailand and stuff. They've got less and less time and resources to dedicate towards propping up the Hermit Kingdom, I think. I don't think, though, that when Tillerson says nothing's off the table, it's an indicator that we're actually going to war with the North Koreans. Now, can we? Yeah, we can. North Korea has quite a few submarines, a hell of a lot of artillery, and a fairly decent number of aging aircraft. What's not clear, though, is that their military, being essentially locked in the 1960s technologically, is even really capable of targeting many of our ships or our aircraft. I don't think personally that they are. I think the only losers, insofar as people outside of the DPRK, in such a scenario would really be the South Koreans, possibly the Japanese. They might take a few chemical warheads. That's why we're deploying THAAD. It's why we've got so many Patriot missile batteries permanently located in these areas. And that number is likely to grow. And by the way, I don't see this as an aggression. This is true with Russia, too. I don't believe in the Russian sort of crap that's going on right now, but when we started to deploy Aegis offshore and similar systems in Eastern Europe and in Turkey, I supported it. Because they're not offensive systems, they're anti-missile systems. It can be seen as a provocation by acting in a deleterious manner towards the nuclear deterrent of Russia. But it's not itself an offensive move. I don't have a problem with such deployment, and I stand with the West on this issue. The same would be true regarding North Korea. The Chinese may not like the fact that we're giving these systems to South Korea and Japan. But it does not matter. These are not offensive weapons. They're defensive mechanisms. They're geared towards North Korea. And the likelihood of China hauling off and suddenly deciding, oh, we're going to attack them, we're going to attack this it's just fairly low. They're too busy building colonies in Africa right now and playing new wave colonialism. They're too busy to prop up the Hermit Kingdom. They're allowing condemnation through internationally for the first time in the last half-decade. But here's another reason why I don't think a military strike on North Korea is inevitable. They keep talking about these red lines. Their new red line is, oh, North Korea must not obtain a deliverable nuclear weapon. But the old red line was they may not obtain a nuclear weapon at all. And that red line was crossed multiple times, and we did nothing. And before that it was they must not develop a truly active nuclear program. And they did, and the red line was crossed, and we did nothing. And in between those two, oh, they can't attempt to test an atomic weapon. They did. Their first test was a failure, and they used that as an excuse for why it didn't actually cross the red line. And before that, before North Korea had the capability of even having a rudimentary atomic program, they said North Korea must respect the sovereignty of the South Koreans. We will guarantee their safety. And yet multiple times the North Koreans are caught trying to tunnel under the DMZ. Several times they try to literally land espionage agents there to go assassinate like the president of South Korea and stuff like that. They fire artillery at islands, sometimes causing actual injuries. They get into spats in the naval sense. They actually manage to grab a hold of and steal a U.S. ship during the end stage of sort of the true Korean tensions. There are all sorts of problems that happen on a fairly regular basis there. Technically, they all crossed that early red line, and all of their other subsequent actions have crossed red lines too. Even the Chinese now come out and say, no, we don't want you to keep testing these atomic weapons, and they keep testing these atomic weapons. They keep firing off long-range missiles, which is a provocation that was once said to cross a red line. They keep crossing the red line, and nobody wants to step up and take responsibility for what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. The Chinese don't really need the hassle of moving in with land forces and trying to liberate North Korea and force on it a mixed model like they tried to do with Dear old Uncle Chang there, I believe, Uncle Jang, Kim Jong-un's uncle. He was seen as the mouthpiece of China years ago, before he was executed. And his urging towards Kim Jong-un was North Korea should adopt essentially a Chinese model. We don't need to enter the world at large, but we need to partner with them more directly. The economic situation here is not working. Now, I've listened to some tales told by North Korean defectors, and based on their knowledge, they actually have sort of moved towards a mixed model, but they kept it more insular. They kept it only within North Korea. That is, there's actually an underground sort of market economy that's tolerated there now because it's the only thing propping up the population, because before, with endemic famine, they actually ran out of food to divvy out to people. So now they've got sort of a market economy. Still brutally totalitarian, still socialistic. You're still giving 90% of anything you produce to the government to redistribute, but at the very least, it's a little bit better than before. It's probably a move because they figured there'd be a revolution if they didn't move towards such a system. Now, if that's true, that probably precludes the idea of an uprising within North Korea that actually supplants the government, which would be one of the only scenarios in which outside powers would intervene. So the slow advancement of other states, of China as it becomes more powerful, will eventually destroy the Juche ideology within North Korea. It will stop proclaiming itself to be openly communist, and it will eventually have that mixed model, if there's no war. In a scenario with war, South Korea is very likely to reunify a large swath of the northern end of the Korean peninsula and take it over. There will be a more or less united Korea. China would probably use it as an excuse to conduct a land grab, and it would just admit maybe the northern half of North Korea as a province or something to continue having that buffer area. They'll move a few Chinese families in, at first for diplomatic purposes, and then when fighting breaks out, what they'll say is, oh, we've got Chinese people living here, we're going to defend them, we're marching in. They march in, they take the land, they say, oh, well, they already had property here or something, so it's ours now. Now it's part of China, essentially. It's a direct vassal state. It's literally a satellite state now. It no longer has full autonomy, like North Korea kind of, sort of did. But Tillerson's comments are being taken wildly out of context by Being Liberal and Salon and MSNBC. They're warning of another Korean crisis. They're warning of an active war there. Technically speaking, the war has been ongoing since the 1950s. It never went away. There's a ceasefire, there's an armistice of sorts, but there's no actual end to the war. The two parties that were involved never signed off and saying, oh yeah, the war is over, go back to your homes. They've been in a war-ready state since the 1950s. They remain in it today. It's one reason their economy sucks. Crisis could break out at any time, but I don't think it's going to be because the U.S. decides in a monopolar fashion, screw the Chinese and their involvement, we're not listening to the Japanese or anything, we're going to go in and start striking their nuclear apparatus. I just don't think that that's likely to happen, because in all possibility, with China no longer really pulling for them, can North Korea even continue existing as a state long-term anyway? The next time they have a period of major famine or whatever, are they going to collapse? I think that's the possibility in everyone's mind. I guarantee there are all sorts of contingency plans that the U.S. and military and the ROK already have for such an advent, for marching in across the DMZ and immediately attempting to grab up whatever they can to preclude the Chinese from grabbing it all up. And when people say, by the way, oh, the Chinese should deal with it, the Chinese are just as reluctant to handle the situation in a direct fashion as we have. Technically, under the red lines that were mentioned by our own presidents over the last couple of decades, we should have technically invaded the DPRK a dozen times already, and we never did. And when they develop a deliverable nuclear weapon, we probably won't do anything about that either. We'll wait until they collapse, because in such a scenario, they may not have the ability to actually deploy those weapons. Right now, for North Korea to actually use any of its atomic payload, it has to put it on a bomber, a rather slow, outdated old airplane, and fly it across the DMZ. That's what they have to do to deploy them. many people seem to be far more worried about the thousands of pieces of artillery and the many tanks and field guns that they have overlooking the DMZ that can technically target anything within maybe 5 to 10 miles of it. They seem far more concerned about that long-range artillery, some of which is rail-mounted and can zip right under a hill line to protect itself if it's fired on, than they are the atomic weapons program there. It's not even clear. All we have is theory. When we're talking about North Korea's atomic weapons, it's just a theory that they even have semi-deliverable atomic weapons. How can we even be sure? It's not like we can go in there and they're going to let us look at all the nukes that they've built. They have older generation 40s era basic atomic weapons. They're trying to make them deliverable. Can they? Who knows? They've got a fairly advanced missile program, but they've got a relatively lackluster number of missiles. They've got a lot of submarines, which are old style. They can't really, I mean, they could, in theory, they could take one of these atomic weapons, wire it up inside of an old diesel sub, and then just go in silently off the Pacific coast and cause a tsunami or something. They could do that. But what would the point be? It'd be suicide as a culture. Everyone would know who did it. Everyone would immediately condemn them. Half a dozen states would immediately invade North Korea. It just wouldn't work. I don't think they'll fire the first shot either. Here's where the stalemate comes in. For decades and decades, this issue has been simmering, and nobody has ever taken the step of firing the first shot. It's a microcosm of mutually assured destruction in a way. It's literally a microcosm of the wider, like, U.S.-Soviet sort of interplay from yesteryear, and now, of course, the U.S., Russia / kind of China and the EU interplay. It's a microcosm of that. The South Koreans don't want their capital leveled by all of that North Korean artillery. They don't want several million people to get turned to ashes within the first hour of fighting. So they're not really willing to start it. North Korea knows that it would, in the long sense, lose, and it would be completely destroyed, possibly even with nuclear weapons. So they're not willing to fire the first shot. It's mutually assured destruction. That's what we see there. What takes that off the table is the large enough scale deployment of THAAD and Patriot missile batteries or something in South Korea and Japan to protect our allies, or the bipolar involvement of both the US and China at the same time, which would totally overwhelm North Korea's capabilities, and we could curb stomp all their artillery and their air power out of existence within 10 minutes probably if we conducted joint strikes, especially if we had naval groups and the carrier groups in the area. We'd far outnumber them in terms of aircraft and ships. They would far outgun them. It's not clear that they'd be able to fight back. I mean, during shock and awe in Iraq, you had a much more sophisticated foe. Less manpower, but more sophisticated, more modern weapons. And it largely up and fled within the first day of fighting. And it didn't really have the capability to fight back. And that was using an older generation of military software and hardware that we had back then. We've developed whole new classes of weapons now. And we're talking about mounting lasers on naval vessels in order to fire on missiles. We're talking about lasers and railguns, and they're still using manually operated artillery from the mid and late 1950s into the 1960s. They're still using older generation MiG fighters and things like that. Now, does that mean that their military is useless? No. All that artillery is still going to pack quite a punch. But mutually assured destruction on the Korean peninsula could also break down if they do develop a deliverable atomic weapon. If they manage to get it onto a missile, and they announce to the world, we are now capable, and we can prove it to the world community, it's not just dick-wagging, yeah, we can launch this missile and nuke Shanghai off the face of the earth. We can nuke Tokyo off the face of the earth. We can nuke, a military base in South Korea. Maybe we can even hit the capital of Alaska, or maybe Honolulu or something. That may be the final red line that forces us to act. But if history is an indicator, all the other red lines, having even the primitive atomic weapon gives them the ability to attack South Korea with them. It gives them the ability to attack China or Japan with them. They have the ability to do so. They could possibly do so before anyone could mount an effective response. And when they crossed that red line, we did nothing. We condemned them. We give them a strongly worded letter. Meanwhile, the population of North Korea continues to starve and suffer. So if humanitarian stuff obviously isn't going to get us to attack, simply having atomic weapons is no longer enough of a provocation. It's like we talk about Iran. If you really think that Iran is developing an atomic weapons program, they're going to get atomic weapons because we're never going to be willing to do anything about it. They're sheltered by the Russians, just as Israel, which hasn't signed the NPT, is sheltered by the US. The Russians and Chinese may look askance to the things that Israel does, but there's nothing that they can do about it. And Israel is to the US as Iran is to Russia and as North Korea is to the Chinese. They're these little sacred cow vassals which can be used for weapons testing in essence, which are militarily advanced, nuclear capable, or in the case of Iran, roughly pre-nuclear states that are still developing those capabilities. Although at some point, if North Korea does get deliverable nuclear weapons and Iran obtains atomic weapons and so forth, and as these things proliferate around, it could drive the whole world haywire. You could see a major extinction because you probably would see a major war. It could go nuclear. But North Korea on its own developing a deliverable system, is it actually going to force them to take action? And then will the Chinese allow such action? They may say no. They've only got one of these missiles, one of these warheads. What are you so worried about? They're never going to fire it. Oh, may cooler heads prevail. That's their new line. The new line of the Chinese, the old line was they've done nothing wrong, they're within their rights, blah, 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 oh, evil West or something. Now that they're more, partnering with the West in economic ways, and they're not so they're too busy developing other nations and doing string of pearls stuff and the Nicaragua Canal crap and so forth. Now they don't do that. They just say, oh, well, whatever. Condemn them all you want, but you're not actually, cooler heads must prevail. Don't get a big dick about the situation. It'd take like 10 minutes to destroy half of their military capabilities if China and the U.S. were both involved at the same time. It'd be a freak show. North Korea would barely survive. Their civilian population, they'd be badly beaten too, because they'd probably be immediately called up to bear arms in defense of their nation, so they'd get shot at as well. It'd almost be a genocide. That may be, by the way, what the ROK is most worried about. When the ROK does ask for this new anti-missile system, it should at least be a little bit worrying, because they probably don't want war to break out. I also don't think they want to have to spend all the money necessary to develop North Korea or admit them as citizens that then can vote and vote for socialist policies in a nation that's relatively conservative. Actually, it might bring balance to their economy. They'd still get rich. Oh, all the South Korean managers and businessmen would get filthy rich because then they'd be able to develop all these mineral deposits and the coal seams and stuff. Korea would become at least as potent as Japan in an economic sense. They'd probably be in the top 5 economies very, very quickly, and then soar up through. They'd be rivaling, maybe India or something with all the minerals that North Korea has. Whether there's the will, though, to ever do that is a totally different story, and Tillerson is just echoing what past presidents have said anyway. There is a red line. If North Korea crosses it, nothing's off the table. They're always vague about what the response will be. What the response is likely to be is condemnation, and nothing more. Condemnation and a few extra anti-missile batteries in South Korea and Japan. Maybe Taiwan. That's what they'll give to them. That's about all.